Snow fell not like weather but like memory, soft, persistent, and without apology. It smoothed over the jagged wounds of the land, whispered across broken fences and brittle twigs, muffling the wild edges of the world. Out on the edge of Pine Hollow, past where the town dared to keep roads, stood a crooked-limbed cabin made of old wood and older silence. Inside, a woman moved like smoke, quiet, practiced, deliberate. Her name was Bonnie McGuire. She was 36, though no one in town ever said so aloud. She'd once been called a fine wife when her husband was alive, then a fine widow when he wasn't. Not much changed in how they looked at her, except that now they expected less. Bonnie wore grief the way others wore aprons, tied about her middle, hands always half wiped on it. But hers wasn't the kind that wailed or drank or threw itself onto caskets. It was the kind that baked bread in the dark, mended sleeves that would never be worn again, and wrote thoughts in the margins of the newspaper long after the ink had dried. Her days were made of wood smoke and water hauling, of tending to a lean milk goat named Letty and brushing out the horse whose name she'd never changed from what her husband had given it, Marshall. She let the fire burn low sometimes just to see how long she could stand the cold. It was a cold day that changed things. A deep, devouring cold that cracked even the strongest pine bones. That morning, the wind had howled strange, not wild, not mournful, but warning. Bonnie had bundled herself for the woods, axe in hand, to collect the last dry kindling before the sky turned to ice. That's when she saw it. At first, it was just a shape, half swallowed by snow. A dark, crooked thing sprawled between brush and fallen logs. She approached slow, boots crunching, hands steady on the axe handle. A man. No, a shadow of one. His skin was darker than the earth, hair braided with beads and blood, a woven sash soaked through and frozen to his side. Apache. That word came into her head not as an accusation but as a whisper, shaped by the voices of town gossip and whispered fireside fear. He was dying. That much was clear. Snow had started to blanket his legs like a burial rite. His breath was shallow, fluttering in his throat like a moth caught in linen. She stood above him a long while, her own breath blooming into fog. The sensible thing, the safe thing, was to leave him. Let the land finish what it started. But Bonnie McGuire had never been much for what passed as sensible in Pine Hollow. She dropped the axe. It didn't feel like a decision, more like a moment she'd been walking toward for years. Getting him back to the cabin took half her strength and all her will. He was heavy with unconsciousness, dead weight that sagged and dragged. Her fingers screamed in the cold, knees bruised from kneeling, back wet with sweat that turned to frost. She whispered apologies to the woods, to her husband's ghost, to the future. Inside, she laid him by the fire, stripped the wet from his limbs, cleaned the wound at his side with hands that didn't shake until they were finished. His blood was darker than hers, richer somehow, like the earth after rain. She packed the wound with moss and cloth, whispered prayers she barely remembered how to say. He didn't wake. Not that night. Not the next. But he breathed. Bonnie slept in the rocking chair those days, keeping one eye on the man she did not know, her rifle close but her fear further. She left water by his side, changed his bandages, watched for signs that death had taken notice. And through it all, she said nothing. Not aloud. Not to him. The cabin took on a new shape, as all homes do when something fragile enters. Every sound became sharper. The creak of the rafters, the stir of the fire, the wind's mutterings through the shutters. The quiet was no longer empty. It held breath and hope and questions. On the fourth morning, his eyes opened. They were the color of dark smoke, watching her without flinching, though she saw confusion in them. She met his gaze with the steadiness of someone who had nothing left to barter but honesty. She did not smile. She did not look away. "You're safe," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "For now." He didn't speak. Not then. But his eyes lingered. Not on her face, on her hands, bandaged from cold and work. As if wondering what made her carry him from death's edge when others would have turned away. Bonnie did not ask his name. Names had power, and it felt too early for power between them. She thought instead about the day the town might come knocking, about what they would say, and how they would call her soft, foolish, even traitor. But none of that was now. Now was tea made from pine needles and thin broth from bones she'd meant to save. Now was the fire, and the man who didn't die. She found herself studying him when he slept. Not out of fear, that had eased, but out of something quieter, more curious. His face was weathered but not old. His hands, even in stillness, looked like they belonged to someone who knew the land better than maps ever could. He had a scar along his jaw, like a knife had once tried to steal his words. He healed slowly, ate little, watched the window more than he watched her. Days passed like smoke drifting up a chimney. One evening, as the light sank into blue, Bonnie sat beside the fire reading aloud from an old farming almanac. Not for him, not at first. Just to hear her own voice again, the way it filled the cracks in the silence. He listened. And she felt it, the shift. The moment when presence became companionship, when the lines between stranger and something else began to blur. He pointed at a word in the book once. A simple act, wordless. But it made her heart startle in her chest. It meant he understood. It meant he was choosing to stay present. That night, she left an extra blanket by his bedroll. She didn't say why. The wind outside howled again. Another storm was coming. She could feel it in her teeth, in the ache that lived in her bones since her husband died. Bonnie sat long that night, eyes closed, listening to the rhythm of his breathing mingled with the crackle of fire. It struck her, quietly, that for the first time in many winters, she wasn't alone. She didn't know what that meant. Not yet. But she didn't dread morning the way she used to. Out beyond the cabin, the snow fell in steady drifts, covering tracks and truths alike. The trees whispered to each other in a tongue too old for humans to hold. In Pine Hollow, no one knew what the widow had done. Not yet. But winter knows how to keep secrets, at least for a while. The days settled into rhythm, soft as breath, deliberate as snowfall. Inside the cabin, where once only grief lived, there now flickered a fragile and unspoken understanding. The man, still unnamed, though not unacknowledged, grew stronger in slow, steady inches. His fever had broken, though his wound remained a taut and aching thing. Bonnie, with sleeves always rolled, tended him with the same quiet persistence she gave to her woodpile or bread dough. She asked nothing of him, not even his name. It was not mercy she offered, not exactly. It was something slower, deeper. A waiting. He spoke no English. Or, if he did, he chose not to use it. Instead, he nodded when she passed him broth, held her gaze longer than required, listened as she read aloud from newspapers or yellowing herb journals. Their communication unfolded like the unfurling of cold hands beside a fire, gradual, unsure, then unmistakably warm. Sometimes he watched her work, eyes tracking the movement of her hands. She worked with grace forged by years of necessity. Even her silences had a rhythm. He watched her chop wood, kneel in the snow to fix a broken fence, stitch the worn lining of her coat. She moved with a stubbornness he recognized. Survival, not pride. She called him you, or sometimes nothing at all. He never corrected her. And she didn't think of him as an intruder anymore. He'd become, somehow, part of the cabin's breath. An echo made flesh. She found herself making a second cup of tea without thinking. Found herself brushing snow from the windows so he could see the moonlight. One night, as dusk bruised the edges of the sky, she caught him standing barefoot by the door, staring at the trees. His hand touched the frame, not as if to leave but as if remembering something. She didn't speak. Only offered a blanket, which he took without thanks, but not without acknowledgement. He began to help in small ways. First, he pulled water from the well when her shoulder ached. Then he swept the cabin floor without being asked. She noticed, but said nothing. Gratitude, she had learned, was best shown in kind. They did not need words. Their silences stretched long but not lonely. When she read aloud, he would sometimes trace shapes in the air, sketching something only he could see. Once he pointed to a sketch she'd made in the dirt with her boot, a crooked pine tree, and nodded. She drew another beside it. He smiled, only a little, and it was the first time she realized how young he might be. Not a boy. Not a man worn by age either. somewhere in that middle space like her. Each night, they shared a fire and a roof and the invisible tether of two souls who had nowhere else to be. But Bonnie knew the world beyond their four walls would not be kind if it found him here. Her cabin was only a temporary shelter, never a refuge that could last. She knew the town would not understand. Pine Hollow was built on fences, wooden, spoken, unwritten. They had strict expectations for women, for grief, for strangers. Especially strangers with skin like his, with beads in his hair and silence as his first language. She remembered the stories her husband used to tell around the fire. Stories meant to stir fear. Of raids and horse thieves. Of Apache warriors who took what they wanted and left smoke behind. He'd puff out his chest when he told them, the other men nodding with the comfort of having something to fear more than themselves. Bonnie had nodded too, back then. Not because she believed it, but because disbelief didn't change the way men chose to live. But now, as she handed the man another cup of tea, her fingers brushing his, she felt the weight of those stories pressing against the truth she now lived with. This was no monster. No savage. He was a man who flinched when the wind howled and sat with quiet reverence before the fire. He never asked to stay, but he hadn't tried to leave. The snow outside piled high, walling them in with white silence. Time slowed, softened. The world became very small, just two people, a hearth, and the tasks of each day. They shared food, heat, and the stillness of snow-covered evenings. She mended his shirt, found beads hidden in the hem that she left untouched. He patched her roof during a brief thaw, his hands sure, his movements reverent. One morning, she found him watching her feed Letty, the goat. He stood still, arms crossed, brow furrowed as if puzzling out something deeper than the task. She caught his eye and tilted her head toward the barn. "You ever keep goats?" she asked, already knowing he wouldn't answer. But his mouth curled at the corner, and he shook his head. Then pointed to the sky. She looked up. Gray clouds. Rolling. Storm again. He nodded. And in that moment, she understood they had come to an agreement, wordless and honest. He would not lie, and she would not demand. There was no need. The days ahead were colder. At night, the wind groaned through the eaves like a mourning voice. Bonnie lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the sound of his breathing from across the room. Not snoring. Just breathing. Human. Alive. Real. Sometimes, in dreams, she saw him as she'd found him, half frozen, bleeding into the snow. But in the dream he opened his eyes first. Always first. And he looked at her not with fear or pleading, but with recognition, as if he had been waiting for her all along. She woke from those dreams not afraid, but hollowed out. Like the dream had pulled something from her chest and left a little light behind. One night, after a long silence broken only by the hiss of the fire, he spoke. His voice was quiet, the vowels rounded and slow. "Why?" She looked up from her sewing. She knew what he meant. Why had she helped him? Why had she not turned away? She considered the fire, the shape of her hands in her lap, the feeling she hadn't had words for until now. "Because you were dying," she said. He shook his head slowly, eyes never leaving hers. She nodded. "Because I was too." And there it was, the first moment not shared but joined. His face shifted, a frown softened by grief, not anger. He looked away only to watch the fire, as if reading something in its movement. The next morning, he handed her a carved stick. It wasn't elaborate, but it had care in it. A bird, wings open, not flying but ready to. She didn't ask what it meant. She understood. It was his way of saying thank you, or maybe stay alive. The rhythm of their days didn't change much after that. But the silences did. They weren't gaps anymore. They were bridges. A shared language not of grammar or sound, but of being seen. Still, Bonnie felt something shifting. Not inside the cabin, but beyond it. A sense that the world outside had begun to stir again. That the stillness they'd been borrowing was about to be reclaimed. One afternoon, while chopping wood, she saw a set of horse tracks cut fresh through the snow at the treeline. Not Tayan's. Not hers. Too deep. Too straight. Someone had come near, maybe watched. She said nothing to the man that night. But she didn't sleep. The next morning, he stood near the window, watching the trees. He turned and looked at her. No words. She nodded. Something was coming. But it had not come yet. And so, she poured another cup of tea, sat beside him, and let the silence speak what their voices could not. The morning they came was soft and silver with frost. The trees stood still, as if listening. The snow had hardened under the night's breath, crusted thick where even the wind dared not tread. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of simmered beans and pine smoke. Tayan was shaping a piece of wood near the fire, slow strokes of his knife carving into the grain with a patience that reminded Bonnie of old rivers, silent but determined. She was spinning yarn from a tangle of old wool. Her hands moved without needing to look. They'd grown so used to this shared quiet that she almost missed the sound. Hooves. Not one. Several. They didn't approach fast. It was not a raid, not a rescue. It was a decision arriving on horseback, wrapped in coats and law and fear. Bonnie stood slowly, heart climbing to her throat. Tayan was already looking at her. His knife was still. His eyes said what neither of them would say aloud. They've come. The knock was not a knock. It was fists and command. The door rattled once, twice. She opened it without reaching for her rifle. That would only make it worse. 3 men stood there, their breath steaming like war horses, coats dusted white, guns easy on their hips. One was the sheriff, Gregory Kane, a man with salt in his beard and gravel in his voice. The others were ranchers, younger, but not gentler. "Bonnie," Kane said, tilting his head in a mockery of politeness, "we need to talk." Her mouth was dry. "You're early for coffee." "No one's here for coffee," said the one on the left, a sharp-jawed boy named Virgil who once courted her niece. "He's in there, ain't he?" Bonnie didn't look back. "He's healing." Kane stepped forward, boots crunching on the frozen threshold. "That man in there, he's Apache. We've had reports. You know what kind of trouble that brings." She looked him in the eye. "I know what kind of trouble fear makes." "Don't test me, Bonnie," Kane said, voice low, almost sad. "People are stirred up. He's not safe here. And you—" He stopped, eyes flickering past her shoulder. "You're making things harder than they need to be." There was a weight to those words, heavy and lined with threat. Bonnie didn't move aside. "He's not a threat." Virgil stepped forward. "You don't know that. He could have been part of the raid near Dry Ridge. Took 3 horses and 2 lives. He's been in this cabin for over a month," she said. "I pulled him from the snow. You think he rode out from Dry Ridge while bleeding to death in the dark?" The third man, silent until now, shifted uneasily. His eyes met hers with a flicker of doubt. He knew she was telling the truth. But knowing the truth was never enough in Pine Hollow. You had to want it. Kane let out a long breath. "Bonnie, listen. We can't have him here. Not like this. Folks are scared. They need resolution." The word sat foul in the air, as if justice could be measured like grain. Bonnie stepped back, not in fear but in surrender to the inevitable. "If you want him, you'll have to see him." Kane nodded. Virgil's hand twitched near his belt, but Kane gestured him down. "Easy. Just a look." They entered with their boots still muddy. Tayan stood at the hearth, not holding a weapon, not speaking, just watching. The sheriff looked at him, long and careful. Tayan didn't flinch. His face was stone, but his eyes were not. They held calm, and something deeper, contempt maybe, or grief, or the exhaustion of being judged by the shape of his skin. "He doesn't look much like a threat," the quiet man murmured. Virgil snorted. "Give him a rifle, see how fast that changes." Tayan said nothing. Bonnie stepped closer to him, placing herself between the fire and the men. Not with drama, just with choice. Kane rubbed his beard. "Here's what we'll do," he said finally. "We don't want blood. No need for more war. But we can't just let him go. Not after what's happened in these parts. It'd break the town in two. Bonnie's jaw tightened. So what do you want? Cain looked at her like the answer was simple. You're a widow. He's in your home. You saved his life. You're all the family he's got in this county. So make it legal. She blinked. Legal? A marriage, Cain said. Paper makes things cleaner. If he's your husband, he's one of us. That's how we keep the peace. Virgil laughed, a sharp, mean sound. That's rich. Make her marry the savage. Cain shot him a glare, but the damage was done. The room turned colder. Bonnie looked at Tayan. His face had not changed, but something in him had gone very still. He was hearing the words, understanding enough. She whispered, "They'll kill you if I say no." He nodded once. Not to agree. To accept. She looked back at Cain. You can draw up the papers. The next 2 hours passed like days. They brought the town clerk. They brought a preacher. They did not bring celebration, nor smiles. Just ink and obligation and a room full of eyes that did not see them, only what they wanted to believe. The wedding was performed in the cabin. Bonnie wore her boots, the hem of her dress smudged with ash. Tayan wore the same clothes he had almost died in. There were no vows, no exchange of rings. Just signatures. The clerk scrawled their names, misspelling Tayan's with something closer to Thomas, and no one corrected it. When the preacher said, "Amen," Bonnie didn't feel married. She felt claimed. She felt like land, like cattle, like something bartered. Tayan stood beside her, a statue carved from dignity and silence. Cain clapped him on the shoulder. "Welcome to Pine Hollow." Then they left. All of them. The door shut with a finality that echoed too loud. For a long while, neither of them moved. Bonnie finally turned to him. "I didn't want that," she said softly. "I wanted you to live." He nodded, then sat by the fire. The carving knife returned to his hand. His fingers worked wood into shape. She watched him, the way his shoulders curved inward slightly, as if the weight of survival was heavier than death had been. The sun had dipped low. The cabin, quiet again, now held a different silence, thicker, more complicated. Not peace. Not even truce. Just endurance. She sat across from him, her hands clasped in her lap. The paper with their names on it sat on the table like a verdict. But she did not look at it. She looked at Tayan. He looked back. And for the first time, she saw something not just behind his eyes, but rising toward them. Not gratitude. Not warmth. Something harder. Like resolve. Bonnie reached forward and picked up the carved bird he'd been working on. The wings were just beginning to take shape. "Finish it," she said. He took it from her, slowly. Outside, the wind began to shift. The storm that had loomed for weeks was moving off. But the sky remained gray. Inside, they stayed seated, still as the mountains, waiting for the next truth to come. The papers made it real for the town, but not for them. Inside the cabin, where the fire still whispered and snow still held to the windows like lace, nothing had shifted except the weight of what had been taken from choice and turned into decree. Tayan moved through the cabin with the same silence he always had. His hands still worked wood, still mended the firewood pile without being asked. He still fetched water before dawn and left it by the hearth. But now, something in him moved a beat slower, as if the air itself had grown heavier, the walls too narrow. Bonnie felt it too, though she kept her chin high and her voice measured. She made their meals, swept the floors, tended the animals, and kept the silence between them from turning brittle. The strange thing was, she didn't feel anger. Not at Tayan, not even at the men who forced their names together with ink and suspicion. What she felt was stranger than anger. It was hunger. A hunger to know who he was beyond what they'd made him. One morning, before the fire caught, she found him sitting outside on the steps, his breath rising in clouds. The snow had melted just enough to reveal patches of brown earth beneath the pines. He didn't turn when she stepped beside him, didn't speak, but she could feel the shape of his thoughts in the cold. "Do you want to leave?" she asked softly. His gaze didn't shift. "Yes." There was no apology in it, no shame, just truth. She nodded. "I wouldn't stop you. I know." They sat like that a long time, shoulders not touching but near. The wind stirred the trees, and somewhere in the distance a hawk called out once, then vanished into the sky. He rose then, slow, and went inside. She stayed. That day she stitched new linings into their coats. His was worn thin under the arms. Her fingers moved with care, remembering the way her mother used to repair things. Quietly, without mention, as if the work of keeping things together was the closest thing to love they ever dared speak aloud. The next night, Tayan left the bird carving by her place at the table. It was finished now. Wings spread, body poised in flight. She picked it up, traced the grain with her thumb, and then looked across at him. "Did it mean something?" she asked. He studied her for a long moment. Then, "Yes." She waited. He hesitated, then answered with effort. "In my people's stories, birds carry messages. Between worlds. Is this a message?" "Yes." Her voice dropped. "What does it say?" His eyes softened. "That I stayed." She held the carving closer and nodded once. It was more than a thank you. More than a gift. It was a memory carved into shape. A quiet proof that he had once chosen to remain, even before the town had forced the word husband onto him. They began to speak more after that. Not often. Not fluently. But in short, deliberate exchanges. Words he had learned over weeks of listening began to find their way out, shaped by his accent, his cadence. Her words, slower now, met him in the middle. Neither of them filled the air with sound just to claim it. Every word they gave each other was a stone placed in a bridge. She learned that his name was not Thomas, as the papers claimed. His name was Tayan, which meant new moon, though he said it without flourish, without pride. "My mother gave it," he said one evening. "What was she like?" He was quiet a long time. Then, "Strong." She did not bow. Bonnie nodded. "I'd have liked her." "She would not like this," he said, gesturing faintly to the paper pinned above the hearth. "I don't like it either," she admitted. He looked at her then, not with the guarded distance he'd held since the beginning, but with something closer to regard. They began to share more than work after that. He helped her fix the chicken coop. She showed him how to brew pine tea the way her grandmother taught her, letting the needles steep long enough to stain the water amber. He drew maps in the dirt outside, places she'd never heard of. Places that lived in the landscape of his memory. He pointed once to the mountains far off. "My people walked there. Before the soldiers came." Bonnie didn't ask which soldiers. She already knew. "They burned our homes," he said simply. "We buried our names in the snow." She couldn't speak for a moment. Her fingers closed around the wooden bird in her pocket. "I'm sorry," she said at last. He looked at her, and something passed through his face, soft, like wind. "You didn't hold the torch." "No," she whispered. "But I live in the house it lit." Tayan didn't answer, but he didn't look away. In the weeks that followed, a kind of tenderness bloomed. Not fast, not bright, but persistent. Like moss in shadow. They moved around each other with less distance, sometimes brushing past in the kitchen, or handing tools back and forth without thinking. One morning she found him humming low as he chopped wood. It wasn't a song she knew, but it calmed her. She began to hum it later when she washed dishes. He noticed, smiled faintly, but said nothing. The town kept its distance, but not its whispers. Supplies came with tight-lipped glances. The preacher's wife no longer waved. Bonnie didn't mind. The weight of their disapproval was less than the weight of pretending. One market day, she rode into town alone. The clerk gave her change without meeting her eyes. A boy spit near her boots and muttered something cruel. She didn't flinch. On the way home, she passed the creek where she and her husband used to fish in silence. The water still moved, still laughed over stones. She realized she hadn't thought of her husband in days. Not with sorrow. Not with love. Just silence. Back at the cabin, Tayan had made stew. The scent greeted her like memory. He had even split the last of the dried herbs into the pot. She sat beside him and ate without speaking. When the bowl was empty, she said, "Thank you." He nodded. "You came back. I said I would. I know." She reached across the table, laid her fingers over his, not fully grasping, just touching. "Do you ever wish it had gone differently?" she asked. His thumb moved slightly beneath hers. "Sometimes." She waited. But not every day. That night, as the fire cracked and the snow fell gently, Bonnie reached for his hand again. This time, he held it. Neither of them moved beyond that. No kiss. No debonnations. Just hands clasped, warm in the hush. A week later, they were building the fence together. The posts had rotted and leaned like weary men. She held them straight as he hammered. At one point, she lost balance and fell into him. He caught her. Their eyes met, close enough to feel each other's breath. He did not kiss her. But he didn't move away. They finished the fence in silence. That evening, she found an old tin box and filled it with seeds, one she'd been saving for spring, even though she hadn't planned to plant them. She handed the box to Tayan. "For the garden," she said. He opened it, sifted through the seeds with care. "You believe we'll still be here?" She thought for a long time. Then, "I believe I want to be." He closed the box and nodded. "Then we plant." There were nights when they still said nothing. But the silence no longer felt empty. It was a shared quilt, wrapped around what could not be spoken and didn't need to be. One such night, she sat with a letter in her lap. It was from her sister, full of concern and questions and quiet condescension. Bonnie read it aloud in pieces. "She says I should come live with her. That I've lost my way." Tayan was stirring the fire. He didn't look up. "Have you?" She folded the letter. "No. I finally found it." He met her gaze and said, "Then burn it." She did. In the final weeks of winter, something changed again. Not between them, but around them. The woods grew restless. Tayan watched the tree lean longer each day. One evening he stood outside long after the light had gone, listening. When he came in, Bonnie saw the tension in his shoulders. She didn't ask. "That night," he said quietly, "there's talk among the pines. I feel it." She placed her hand over his. "If it comes, we'll face it." He didn't argue. In the cabin, the paper with their names still hung above the hearth, but it no longer defined them. Their bond had shifted, no longer forged by fear or decree, but chosen in hours and work and touch. They had not spoken of love. Not yet. But something deeper had rooted itself, something gentler than passion and stronger than names. And though neither of them could say what the spring would bring, they both planted the garden. Together. Without a word. The wind had changed again. It came down from the north like a breath held too long, dry and sharp and tasting faintly of smoke. Not the kind that rose gently from homestead chimneys, but the harsh, bitter scent of something distant and burning. Tayan smelled it before Bonnie did. He stood in the doorway at dawn, bare feet pressed against the old pine floor, and did not speak. The horizon was still quiet, the sky the color of old iron. But something in the trees had gone silent, and it was not the silence of peace. It was the pause before a reckoning. Bonnie came behind him, still tying her shawl. She followed his gaze and knew without asking. The fire they'd kept carefully at bay was drawing close, not flames in the trees, but in the eyes of the men who had decided once more that fear was easier to carry than understanding. That afternoon, a rider passed the cabin without slowing. No wave. No words. Just a hard look and a faster pace when Tayan stepped into view. Bonnie recognized the man. He worked for the town store, the same one who had refused to sell her thread the week before unless she paid in coin, not eggs. She watched him disappear between the trees and knew it wouldn't be long now. Tayan didn't speak of it. He returned to the garden, checking the tender shoots they'd planted just weeks before. Their roots were shallow still. He brushed dirt from a stalk and looked at it the way one might look at a child's first drawing. Proud, worried, already bracing for the wind that might come to tear it loose. Bonnie joined him, kneeling beside the small patch of hope. "We'll lose them," she said. He didn't ask what she meant, whether the seedlings or something more. He only said, "Not yet." That night, they didn't light the lantern. They sat in near darkness, the fire banked low. The carved bird rested on the mantel, watching them. Tayan's hands were steady around his cup, but Bonnie could see the storm behind his eyes. He was thinking of his people, of the friends who had not returned from the woods, of the ones whose names were never written down because paper refused to hold them. She saw him weighing the balance between staying and leaving, between surviving and being free. "You don't have to stay," she said, the words brittle in her mouth. "Not for me." He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the pouch he kept tucked behind the stacked firewood. From it, he drew something small, wrapped in soft leather. He placed it on the table between them. Inside was a necklace, strung with smooth bone beads, dyed cords, and a single carved stone, green and veined like moss. "My sister made it," he said, "before we were scattered." Bonnie touched it, careful not to displace its shape. "It's beautiful." She wore it when she ran. Bonnie looked up. Did she make it far? No. The silence held. "She'd like you," he added, voice low. Tears stung her eyes, sudden and fierce. "You don't know that." "I do," he said. She saw people, not fences. The next morning, the smoke was visible. A thin line of it against the pale blue sky, rising from the pines north of the ridge. Tayan watched it without blinking. Bonnie felt it in her stomach first, a coiling dread that wrapped itself tight. It wasn't just a fire. It was a signal. Someone had set it, not to burn, but to draw others in. By midday, the tracks began to appear. Hoofprints in the thawing mud, wide boots in the snow-melted brush. She saw them when she went to check the trap lines. Fresh, deliberate. Tayan met her halfway back, his bow in hand. Not raised, not drawn, just held like something remembered rather than wielded. They spoke without speaking. Bonnie packed what little she needed. A flask, dried meat, a few books. Tayan packed nothing. He'd never claimed any part of the cabin as his. He looked at it now the way a man might look at a place he'd already buried. "I want to burn it," he said quietly that evening. Bonnie didn't flinch. "Then we burn it." "But not because we're afraid," he said. "No," she agreed. "Because it's time." They waited until dusk. Tayan lit the fire from inside, starting at the hearth. It was slow to catch, reluctant almost. The old wood creaked and hissed as it began to accept its fate. Bonnie stood outside, holding the carved bird. She did not cry. Not this time. As the flames climbed, she watched the smoke twist into the branches. It was not the smoke of anger or destruction. It was a funeral pyre. For who they had been. For the place that had once been shelter and prison both. Tayan stood beside her, his face lit orange and gold. She reached for his hand. He took it. "We'll go south," she said. He nodded. They rode out before the roof fell, taking the old trail past the dried creek bed. The moon was high and bright, the trees silver in its glow. They did not look back. But the world wasn't ready to let them leave quietly. Just past the ridge, where the land dropped into the low scrub and the air smelled of cedar, the ambush came. 3 riders. Guns drawn. Shouting. "Stop there!" Bonnie felt her body seize, her heart crack open. Tayan pulled the horse up short. He dismounted slowly, arms raised. The leader, a man she didn't know, but who wore the same badge Kane once had, pointed a rifle at Tayan's chest. "You're harboring a fugitive." Bonnie dismounted too, stepping forward. "He's not a fugitive. He's Apache. And he's my husband." That gave them pause, but not enough. "He's under suspicion for an attack on a supply train. Witnesses claim they saw him." "That's not possible," Bonnie said, voice flat. "He's been with me." One of the men laughed. "That's what you'd say, isn't it?" Tayan said nothing. Then, suddenly, he stepped forward, out of reach of her grasp. "Let her go," he said. "You don't speak for her," the leader snapped. "I speak to protect her," Tayan said. "You want blood. I'm giving you a target, not her." "No," Bonnie said, stepping beside him. "We stand together." The leader lifted his rifle. It happened fast, too fast to stop. A shot, then another. But not at Tayan. Bonnie stumbled. For a second, everything was still. Then Tayan caught her in his arms, lowering her gently to the ground. Her side was wet. Not fatal, but bleeding fast. She blinked up at him, dazed. "I'm all right," she whispered. "Stay." The men were shouting now, arguing. One of them had fired without command. Tayan rose slowly, cradling her head in the crook of his coat, then turned to face them. "She is not your enemy," he said. "Neither am I." He lifted his hands again. The tension in the clearing cracked open. The second rider, younger, dismounted. He stepped forward, rifle lowered. "This ain't justice," he said. "She's bleeding. This ain't right." The leader hesitated. The spell broke. "We're done here," the young man said. The others, unsure now, followed him back. They left. Just like that. Tayan fell to his knees beside Bonnie, tore strips from his cloak, pressed them to the wound. "You didn't have to," she whispered. "I did." Later, she would not remember the ride south, only the warmth of his arms, the murmur of his voice, the steadiness of his breath. They found shelter in a hidden hollow, where the wind spoke a different language and no one looked for names. Tayan cared for her there, building fires from damp wood, boiling roots, changing her dressings. She healed. In time, she walked again. In time, they planted seeds in soil that had never known violence. They lived without names, without papers, without the weight of any past but their own choosing. Some nights, they sat by the fire and spoke softly of things once feared. Bonnie would trace the scar by her ribs and say, "It was worth it." Tayan would place her hand over his heart and say, "So was you." And if travelers passed through, they never asked questions. But some, those with eyes shaped by sorrow, would pause and listen to the wind in the trees. They'd hear the fire crackle. They'd notice the carved bird hanging above the hearth. And they'd know. They'd know that somewhere out in the wide and wild west, two souls had once refused to be separated. Not by bullets, not by borders, not even by silence. And that they had chosen each other again and again, until the world ran out of reasons to say no.